Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Ty, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar, 5 Considerations When Switching HR Software in 2022. This event is being presented by HR Morning and sponsored by PayPro. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the chat box in the control panel. If they're regarding the subject being presented, I'll add them to the queue for questions at the end. Lastly, today's presentation can be downloaded from the handout section of the control panel. Now I'd like to introduce your speaker, Patrick Sayers.
Thanks, Ty. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. I know everyone has options with how they use their day, so we appreciate you taking an hour to go over some hopefully valuable information for everyone. So as Ty mentioned, today we're going to be talking about 5 considerations when switching HR software in 2022. So one thing I like to do before I get into the heart of the presentation, I always like to give just a brief overview. I promise this is not going to be a commercial. Just a brief overview of Newcastle Research, what we do, who I am. I always try to put myself in the audience's seat, if you will, virtual seat, whenever I'm listening to a presenter, particularly when they're providing, advice of some kind, recommendations. I always like to understand where do they get those recommendations, right? What do they do? So consider this the why should I care what Patrick has to say portion of the program, because it's always valuable for me, as I said, if I'm sitting in an audience, to understand their background, to really say, oh, well, why should I listen to them? Why are they an expert? So Newcastle Research, we are a completely independent research and consulting company. We, in short, help customers choose the best HR solution for their needs, right? And so part of that is understanding the market. And so the logos that you see here, the companies that you see here are here for illustrative purposes. These should not be interpreted or viewed as recommendations of any kind. This is mostly just to kind of give you a sense of who we cover, like who we, the market. And this is also indirectly for your benefit, but this is the market that we're talking about. If this isn't who you're interested in hearing about, then you're in the wrong webinar. But so these are the kind of players that we talk to our customers about, our customers being organizations looking to add a solution like this to their HR technology suite, right? And so they're looking to use a solution like this. So part of understanding, how to help our customers is understanding the market, but the other half of the equation is understanding the customer, right? And so obviously the customers that we work with, that we engage with, 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000, employee company engages with us to help them find a solution that meets their needs. We have to understand that customer, but when I talk about understanding the customer, I'm talking about understanding the customer more generally, right? So understanding that customer that has had a successful, HR technology, HCM, HRIS, whatever term you want to use. And those, by the way, are not completely interchangeable, but for the purposes of our presentation today, I'll kind of treat them as one. The company that has a successful rollout, that are happy with the solution they're using today, how did they get there, right? Because and I always talk to customers about this, it's intuitive and maybe on the surface quite easy to say, okay, we need a new technology solution, we need a new HCM, right? Either we're small and growing and we're using kind of some mishmash of a homegrown system or Excel spreadsheets today, or we're using a system today that we're really not happy with, and so we're going to go out and search for a new system. It's very easy to say, okay, well, we'll just ask somebody that looks like us. Maybe they're in the same industry, maybe they have roughly the same amount of employees, maybe they're in the same geography. Who do they use? Are they happy? We'll just use that. I wish I could tell you that it was that easy, but unfortunately it's not. And the example I always give people is, you could have, if you go to, vendor XYZ, you go to their user conference, you could have 2 customers sitting at the lunch table, in between sessions, and one of those customers might hate the solution. They really might. They're there just to try to figure out any last ditch effort to try to make it work. And then the other person at the lunch table might love the solution, right? And they might look alike, right? They might be in the same industry. As I said, they might have the same number of employees. They might be in the same geography. Like on paper, they might look very similar. And so really, in a nutshell, that kind of explains more than anything else what Newcastle Research does, what I do, what I help customers with. My job is to understand how that happens, right? So why is one running away from this HCM vendor, and why is the other one, loving them, right? And so what we've found over the years in working with customers, and probably working with hundreds of customers at this point, it's more about understanding the questions that they asked along the way, to identify where things went wrong with the customer with the organization who really doesn't like the solution they're using today versus the organization that really could love their solution more. It's not about, it's not necessarily about how or where they ended up. It's about the journey to get there. What questions did they ask? What mistakes did they avoid? What things did they consider? And so that's what we're covering today. We're covering 5 considerations when switching HR software in 2022. And actually, I snuck one in. I didn't change the title because it's kind of top 5 has a nicer ring to it. But I'm actually going to cover 6 today because there's one that that I've always wanted to put into the top 5. Whenever you rate it, it's kind of an opinion thing. But I'm working with a customer right now, and I just had to add another one. So you get a little bonus today. And I'll throw this out there. By design, this webinar is designed to cover a lot of ground, right? And so any one of these topics that we cover, we could spend the full hour just on that, right? We're going to talk about architecture. We're going to talk about customer service. We're going to talk about a number of things. And so I'm going to cover a lot of ground, so we can't get too in the weeds on it. So if anyone has any questions, if you don't, there's going to be a Q&A session at the end. If you don't get your question answered, if you want to cover any of this stuff in more detail, please feel free to reach out. I really don't mind the follow-ups. I used to spend a couple minutes at the front end of presentations like this, putting people's mind at ease that they're not going to be walking into a sales call. It's not that. But what I've found over the years, based on customer feedback or the people who do follow up, their feedback, to the extent people hesitate to follow up, to take me up on the offer to have a follow-up conversation after the webinar if they have more questions, it's mostly that they don't want to waste my time. And so please don't hesitate. Those conversations are always mutually beneficial. I love hearing from customers, about what they're going through. Even if they don't formally engage with Newcastle, it's super valuable for me to hear, why don't you like the system you're using today? Like, who else are you looking at? What questions are you asking? So if you don't have, as I said, if you don't have your question answered, if you need more information on any of the topics we cover, feel free to reach out. My contact information will be at the end. So consideration number 1, what's the right HR technology vehicle for your needs? And so by vehicle, I mean, human capital management, PEO, professional employer organization, HRO, BPO, managed services. There's a bunch of different ways for organizations to consume an HR technology solution. And this it's not a super common thing that comes up when I'm working with customers, but it comes up often enough. And when it does, it's just so debilitating that it's worth covering. And so, long story short, if the final decision is between different types of vehicles, once you get to the end of your decision process, then that search didn't reflect your buyer's needs. And I have 3 different actual road vehicles up on the screen just to illustrate the point. I use car analogies a lot because most people can relate to buying a car. So there's nothing wrong with any of the vehicles on the screen here, right? You have a Tesla, I think that's a Ducati, and a Land Rover. But the point I want to convey is that these vehicles were designed to do very different things, right? So if you're commuting 200 miles a day round trip in New England where it snows, you can't use a Ducati for that, and you probably don't even want the Range Rover because it's going to get horrendous gas mileage, right? But likewise, if you're going camping every weekend, you're probably not going to want the Tesla, right? And so you really have to pick a vehicle that is designed to meet your needs. And then once you pick that vehicle, by all means, then you want to go in and compare vehicles within that category. So by all means, look at the different kind of vehicles out there. Look at PEO, look at HRO, managed services, BPO, HCM, and by HCM, I mean a system that your internal team will use, like the logos we had on the front of the slide, like an ADP, Workday, that ilk. Look at all the different varieties out there, but decide on the type of vehicle that best fits your needs, and then evaluate options within that category. So if you get to the end of your process, because oftentimes, and I say this a lot, if a customer makes their way to Newcastle Research, it means they're not happy today, right? And so sometimes a customer will call and they're at square one, right? Square zero even. All they know is they're not happy with the solution they're using today, and they need some help, right? And sometimes I get a call at the other end of the spectrum where somebody, actually, I did a webinar last quarter and I got a call like the next day. They were like, yeah, we're about to sign and we just want a third-party opinion. So I'll get calls like that where they're just at the 11th hour and they just want a third party, but typically it's somewhere in the middle, right? They understand they're unhappy. They know they need something else. They've already started to look. And when I say they, typically it's kind of a selection committee, but sometimes it's just, an HR team of one, right? And so they've started to look at different providers. And so they're already kind of down the road a little bit of research, and they give me a call, right? And so sometimes they're looking at PEO and managed services and this, and I really try to focus there, on the vehicle, and then do that. But so yeah, as I said, not a common one, but really debilitating when it happens. So this brings us to our first poll question. I think there's 3 poll questions throughout the deck. Part of the reason I put these in is because I think it's interesting for the attendees to see what others are going through as well. But it also helps me understand the audience, so I can kind of tailor, to the extent I can, tailor the talk to the people in the audience. So why don't you take a minute and fill that out, and we could talk about the results in just a second.
All right, Patrick. So it looks like you've got a pretty good spread here. 42% said dissatisfaction with customer service. 65% say missing functionality. 29% say not easy to use. 10% we feel ROI should be higher, and 61% too many systems.
Yeah. Okay. So that is a pretty good mix, and that's pretty in line with what we typically see. Customer service is always a big one, and then too many systems is also a cause of a lot of pain as well. So thanks everyone for pulling out. That helps. It's interesting on the too many systems one. Often I'll get a call, and people, because part of my job when I talk to organizations is to understand why are they in pain, right? What's the problem? In order to help solve the problem, I need to understand what the problem is, like where are their pain points. And so I always have this conversation with customers I work with, and it's interesting, how often, and we'll talk about this as we go through the deck, things like customer service are actually sometimes a symptom of an underlying problem of having too many systems underneath, right? So they don't know who to call. When they call that person, they don't know the answer, or there might be a third party underneath the covers that, so it's interesting what's the underlying, disease, if you will, and what's the symptom. But thanks for everyone for filling that out. So consideration number 2, that's actually a great segue. Is the solution single HCM or integrated HCM? So the first kind of public service announcement aspect of this is for everyone in the audience, for customers, organizations, who are evaluating different solutions out there, to understand is that different vendors will define these terms, not just these terms, but pretty much any lingo that you'll encounter along the way. They'll define them differently, and so that's always something to watch out for. What I see a lot is a customer will ask a vendor, hey, is this a single HCM, or is this solution a single database, something along those lines, and the person and the sales executive on the other end will say, oh, this solution is completely integrated. And so sometimes they're trying to kind of, do a little bait and switch, or, look at the shiny ball over here and don't pay attention to the lie, or, the Wizard of Oz, don't look at the man behind the curtain. So sometimes they will intentionally try to mislead, but sometimes they actually don't know, right? The marketing team at that human capital management company might have told all the reps that, oh yeah, this is integrated. Whenever somebody asks about a single HCM, just tell them it's integrated, and they believe that it is. So anyway, that's the first point, is just to understand that different companies will define these things differently. But what you see on the slide here is how Newcastle Research defines it, and it's how most of the market defines it. So a single HCM is built from the ground up on a single code base, right? And so this one employee record, you'll often hear single database solution. Those are synonymous. An integrated HCM simply means solutions that were built separately, and then kind of stitched together behind the scenes. And that could be, there's a bunch of different scenarios where that could arise, right? It could be a company that has, for example, HR payroll solution in-house, and they partner with a third party for something like time and attendance or talent management or some other module within the full suite HCM solution. And so it is actually that one of those modules, one or more of those modules are owned by a separate company, and it's just a partner. So that's an integrated solution. It's not on a single database. It's not built on the same code base because it's owned by separate companies. But even if it's owned by the same company, doesn't necessarily mean that it's a single HCM. For example, that same HR payroll provider who has historically partnered for, as I said, time and attendance or talent management, maybe they decide, oh, well, we want to have that in-house, and so they buy that partner, or they buy a different, competitor of that partner, right? And so now technically they can check the box for HR, payroll, benefits, time and attendance, all the talent management modules, onboarding, recruiting, performance management, succession planning, learning, compensation, all those things. They can offer under one umbrella, one brand, if you will. That doesn't mean it's a single HCM, right? Because those code bases, those solutions were developed separately. And so just because they're owned by the same company and offered through the same HCM vendor doesn't mean they're still not stitched together behind the scenes. So that's something to be aware of. So why do you care, right? So, I talk to customers a lot about, so you can have an integrated HCM and be very happy, and you can have a single HCM and be very happy. So, but there are a lot of benefits to having a single HCM. I just talked about someone about this yesterday. It's kind of that best of breed, if you're familiar with that term, or kind of going with a single system methodology, or philosophy, if you will. But the benefits for a single HCM are far-reaching, if you will. So there's no need to. I have a couple points here. We could have a whole presentation just on this, but there's no need to manually enter and update data into separate systems, right? A single system requires one update, and you experience it on your, if you have an iPhone or Android, any kind of smartphone. There will be apps that are, embedded in the core technology, like an Apple app, but you can also have third-party apps, right? And so we all experience that, where like Apple might have a big rollout, of a new platform update, and some of your apps, some of the third-party apps might be a little glitchy for a few days, right, until they figure that out. Same type of thing with this, right? If you have things running around on different databases, you need to have those databases talking to each other behind the scenes, right? Whether that's through a third party or whether it's an acquired solution. And it might not be a mission critical thing if it's on your phone, right? But when you're talking about people getting paid on time, it becomes a lot more important, right? So, and I mentioned on one of the earlier slides, it was actually after we filled out the poll, I talked about that symptom versus the underlying problem. Sometimes, it'll be, the customers that I talk to will talk to me about the pain they're having with customer service. And after I talk to them a bit, I get them to see that it's actually heavily related to the architecture that they're using, right? Because they have maybe 3 different parties behind the scenes. So when they call up to their primary, HR payroll provider, the person they're talking to doesn't know the answer to the question. Sometimes if they're asking about, for example, time attendance, if they partner with that, or partner for that, or talent management, if they partner for that. So what they're experiencing is a customer service issue, because the person they're getting on the phone doesn't always have the answer to they have the answer to their question for HR and payroll, because that's an in-house solution, but they don't have the answer to their question, and so that creates the whole, telephone nightmare, call center nightmare. And so sometimes I talk to customers and get them to see that, oh, well, that's actually architecture based, right? And so security issues, that there's just a tremendous amount of benefit to having that solution on a single database. So one of the things I talk to customers a lot about is choosing a solution that's best for your company is really a matrix of decisions, right? There is no one unicorn, that checks all the boxes, right? Because everyone wants, in theory, the same thing. They want the best technology, the best architecture. They want the best functionality within all the modules. They want the best customer service, and they want the best price, right? And so, but you can't. There is no such solution, right? Because if it has the best customer service and the best user interface and the best user experience, the best, most intuitive workflows, and the best architecture behind the scenes and the best functionality, guess what? That's going to be the most expensive product out there, right? So something's got to give. And so I talked, as I mentioned, I use car analogies a lot. If you have the absolute best of everything, whatever that is in your mind, a Ferrari, a Porsche, whatever it is, Lamborghini, that's going to be a really, really expensive car, right? Whereas a Toyota Camry is far, far, far less expensive, but it's not going to be as luxurious, right? But that's not to say that there's anything, you could find a number of Ferrari owners, I'm sure, that will tell you that that's the best car for them, right? And you can find just as many more, because there are more of them on the road, Toyota Camry owners that love that vehicle, right? There's a reason. I think it's the #1 vehicle sold in the US, right? And so there's always a balance you have to go through, and this is one of the things I help customers do is understand, what their needs are, what their must-haves are, what their nice-to-haves are, their budget, and walk them through and try to prioritize that matrix of decisions. And the reason I bring that up here is there really are no must-haves, right? Because you can always find a solution that is going to meet your needs, depending on what those needs are, is what I'm saying. So, but the reason I bring it up here is that single HCM for me is about as close to a must-have as you can get, just because I know from experience how big the ripple effect of that is, and how many things that can touch, reporting, that type of thing. And the example I give is, I live in New England. It snows here a lot, although not this year. And I have an all-wheel drive car. Like, is that a must-have? No, I have had two-wheel drive cars. But the point is, I would have to have a very, very good reason not to get an all-wheel drive car. And so that's what I talk to customers about. You better have a really good reason not to go with a single HCM because of how, because of that ripple effect, as I mentioned. I just want to keep an eye on the time. I think we're doing okay. Consideration number 3. This is something I talk to customers a lot about as well. Reselling scenarios can be beneficial or detrimental. So there are 2 situations you want to avoid when you're talking about reselling scenarios. Situation number 1, a customer buys a solution from a single provider and assumes it's a single system. And we talked a little bit about this before with that architecture. And the reality is a core component is delivered through a third party. And the result, the customer experiences disconnected workflow, disconnected user experience, support, as we talked about, for that one module isn't as good as the other modules. And now, we understand why, right? Because when you call up that customer service rep, they might be really, really well versed in the solution that is their own, right? But that third party solution, they might not be as good at, right? And if that's your single point of contact, if you don't have a direct relationship with that third party time and attendance or talent management provider, whatever it is, and if you don't have access to them, then you're going to have that kindergarten game, telephone game nightmare that we've all experienced, right? When you call up and they don't know the answer, oh, let me get back to you, right? And so we've covered that a little bit along the way when we talked about architecture, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but I want to spend a little bit more time on the second scenario that you want to avoid, which is, in my experience, less intuitive for customers, which is the customer doesn't include any resellers in their search, right? And so what I hear a lot is, well, why would I buy from a reseller when I can buy directly, from the software developer? And that's not a bad instinct, on the surface. But the problem is, customers will eliminate from consideration what could be a better option. And this is something that is often surprising to the customers I talk about is reselling scenarios. We've already talked about why they can be detrimental if it's multi-database solution of covers and so forth. But reselling scenarios can actually be better for the customer. And so sometimes it's surprising for the organizations that I talk to learn, for them to learn that there are times when I will recommend going through a reseller over the software, over the HCM provider that actually developed the software, because sometimes, for a number of reasons, the primary one is usually comes down to customer service. But I'm going to give you a little worksheet on the next slide to kind of walk you through when it makes sense and when it doesn't make sense. So this is a continuation of consideration number 3. So these are key questions to ask to maximize your chance of success, right? To minimize, those 2 scenarios that we talked about on the last slide. So what is being resold? Is it a complete solution, or is it a module to round out a core offering, right? And I have caution flags here rather than, an automatic kick out. As I said, it's not. There are customers out there that are happy with the solution. And actually, I worked with a customer last year, and that fell into this camp, right? They had their architectural management firm. They had a very specific accounting payroll software that they really liked, that was really specific to their industry. And so they intentionally went down the road of a multi-database solution. And that was actually the best thing for them, because that one solution that they had was so important to their business, right? So, but generally speaking, I encourage customers to kind of go down the path of a single database if they can get it. So when you're evaluating reseller scenarios, first question is, what is being resold? If it's a complete solution, in other words, if that reseller is selling an entire suite that was developed by somebody else, that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Because from an architecture standpoint, you're still getting that one solution. And then, question number 2 is, what is the underlying technology? The reason we have to carve that out as a separate question is because sometimes there are resellers selling a complete solution that is actually a multi-database solution. So you have to go a little bit deeper, right? And that gets back to one of the first points we talked about: is it a single HCM or is it an integrated HCM? And then the last question you want to ask is, why is it being resold? And this is an important one. They're all important, but this is kind of a underweighted one, less intuitive would probably be the best way to phrase it. Is it a long-term strategy that reseller relationship is a long-term strategy of both companies, or is it a stopgap? And here's an example of what I mean. So there might be an HR payroll provider who is developing their own time and attendance solution. They're developing their own talent management functionality, whatever that is within that bucket. But it's not quite ready yet, right? And so they expect that will be ready in 18 months, 24 months, whatever it is, whatever the milestones are on their roadmap. And so they're partnering near term. So as a customer signing up for that, that somewhere in the middle of your 3-year contract, your partnership, somewhere down the road, your team, your internal HR team and all of your fellow employees are going to have to learn a completely new system, right? So that's disruptive, right? And so you want to know when you sign up, you want to know what that system is going to look like. And you may be okay with that if they're rolling out a new solution next year or in 18 months or 2 years down the road, but you just need to factor that into the decision. So if it's a long-term strategy of both companies, that's more stable. You understand what that's going to look like, and generally speaking, that's a benefit. If it's a stopgap, then you're going to have to learn some things along the way. All of your employees are going to encounter a new learning curve midstream, and that can be really disruptive for your business. Okay, I think that brings us to our next poll question. What is your company using today for your HCM needs? Multiple HCM vendors, a single HCM vendor, a homegrown system, a PEO? So again, I'll give you a minute to fill that out as well.
All right, you got another good mix here, Patrick. 35% answered multiple HCM vendors, 44% a single HCM vendor, 26% homegrown system, and 9% PEO.
Okay, yeah, so that is a good mix. That's a pretty high percentage, not high, but relatively high compared to when I normally get this full of PEOs. So I think we probably have some smaller companies tuning in, which is great. Yeah, but multiple HCM vendors. If we kind of remember back to the first poll, multiple systems. There's a high correlation between using multiple HCM vendors and paying with multiple systems. So thanks. I would have been surprised if A was 0. But thanks everyone for that. That helps me understand who the audience is, so I can tailor the talk. Okay, consideration number 4. What is the implementation plan? So the implementation plan, often, as I mentioned, if a customer makes their way to me, it means they're not happy, right? No one ever calls Newcastle Research to just tell us how much they love their system. I would be happy to field that call, by the way, but no one does. So they're in pain. They need help, finding a new solution. And so, as I said earlier, it's always important for me to understand, why they're unhappy, why they're in pain, what's the problem. But it's always important for me to understand and interesting for me to hear when did things go off the rails, right? Because at some point, the organization that I'm talking to, at some point they were really excited about the solution. They signed with them, right? And so at some point they put their John Hancock on the dotted line and said, no, we're really excited to partner with you guys. We're gonna pay you, hopefully forever, to help us. And so at some point things went off the rails, and it's interesting to hear how often things started to go off the rail before the system even went live, right? They went off the rails during the implementation. And it's really, really critical to make sure you understand what that implementation plan looks like before you sign. Because I can tell you, it's probably half the time. I should probably track that more accurately, but off the top of my head, I would say about half the time, the beginning of the end of that relationship was before, as I said, before the system even went live. Before they even get out of the implementation, they started to hate each other, right? Or rather, the customer started to hate that HCM vendor. So what to look for, right? So the vendor should have a detailed plan. What resources should the customer expect to commit in terms of time, staff, et cetera? What is the vendor's responsibility and what is the customer's responsibility? And I get it, I do. I work with HR and finance and technology people on the customer side every day. That's our core business. And so I understand that your job is to use this system. Your job is not to find a new system. That's my job. And that's what I do. And that's a full-time, I built a company around it, right? So having go find a new system is something that's above and beyond what you normally have to do in a day, and that's a lot of work and it's a lot of stress. And believe me, I get it. I do, because that's who I work with every day. And what I always caution customers, because I can see it every time they get to the kind of the finish line, if you will, of choosing a new vendor, and they think they're done, and you're not. That's one half of the battle. You can't go back to your day job yet, because the first phase of taking you out of your day job is searching for a new solution, searching for a new provider. The second phase of taking you out of your day job is getting that up and running, and it's so important to get that right. Because what I often see is the selection committee, they sign, they choose somebody, and then they breathe a sigh of relief. They're like, oh, the pain is over, now we're good. No, now you got to make sure that it gets plugged in correctly. So you're halfway there. You're halfway through the marathon. So what to watch out for? And as I said, often the vendor is largely to blame for not having a good game plan. So make sure that they have a detailed plan. Make sure that they can share with you the milestones, what's expected from them, what's expected from the customer. if you hear any form of, we'll figure it out when we get there, we do it all the time, no need to worry, that's a big red flag. Proceed with caution. Make sure you get all your answers before you sign on the dotted line. Because if the customer, that's the box down the bottom, if the customer doesn't know what to expect during the implementation, I've seen it time and time again, it's a recipe for disaster. All right, one quick look at the time. I think we're doing okay. So this is the one I inserted. This was originally not in the presentation. So consideration number 6 was originally 5, but I inserted this. Who needs to be involved on the customer side? Because I see this a lot. So consider this kind of bonus material. Get buy-in early across the functional areas on the customer side. And what I mean by that, not buy-in on the solution that you're going to choose, because obviously that's at the beginning of the process. You don't know who you're going to choose. What I mean is get buy-in on the process. And sometimes that's get buy-in on whether or not you need a new solution, right? And I see this all the time. I see different forms of this all the time. And I'm working with a couple of customers right now that are experiencing this. One of them I actually told to go back to the drawing board and say, because they were like, all right, we're going to do this and this. And I said, all right, well, how does IT feel about this? How does finance feel about this? And they're like, oh, we're not going to worry about that now. We're going to go pick a solution and then we're going to get them on board later. And I said, no. I said, you got to get them on board now. I said, because if you don't, 2 months from now, 2 weeks from now, or however long your search takes, you're going to get something that's really, you're excited about, and then you're going to go to IT and you're going to realize, oh, well, how do we handle this? How do we handle this? How do we handle the security? How do we handle, in this case, one of the customers I'm working with, how do we handle these multiple geographies? So you got to get those people on board early, not just from a tactical standpoint of understanding what all the needs are across the functional areas and the across the organization, but just from a teamwork standpoint. It creates a sense of involvement and accountability from the beginning. So the bullet points on the left are what I would recommend, are the functional areas that I would recommend getting involved. HR, obviously, get executive sponsorship, finance, IT, operations, and then within HR, to the extent, as I said, I work with customers smaller than 100 employees. The smallest company I worked with last year, I think, had 18 employees, and that was an HR department of 1, right? And so I work with a lot of those organizations, and I also work with very large organizations with tens and tens of thousands of employees across, all 5, continents, 35 countries. I'm working with a company right now, and so in that scenario, there would be different functional hats that need to be involved. Somebody from payroll, somebody from benefits, talent management, et cetera. So get everyone involved, get everyone virtually in the room, if you will. And all these people aren't going to be involved in every step of the process, right? They're not all going to sit in on every demo. They're not going to all sit in on every call with me. They're not going to sit in on every call with the vendors that you're looking at. But it's important to get everyone involved early and get their buy-in. At a start, just to make sure that everyone's on the same page about whether or not you need a new solution. That can go a long way. So that one's important enough. That one, as I said, that's bonus material. Which brings us to our last poll question. What is the most important criteria in selecting your next HCM solution?
All right, so it looks like we've got 76% features functionality, 41% price, 65% ease of use, 44% customer service, and 53% consolidation.
Okay, that's interesting. Again, a pretty equal mix, but one thing that caught my attention was on the first poll, the biggest pain points, customer service was actually one of the number one pain points. And here it's still a sizable representation, but not among the top ones in terms of what the most important criteria is, which is actually a great segue. What I'm going to talk about, consideration number 6, customer service, right? So how is the HCM provider's customer service? Typically, it's the number one reason why, one of the things that Newcastle Research does, we also do survey work, but these are questions that I ask every customer that comes our way. And based on all that data that we collect, 2 out of 3 customers cite poor customer service as the primary reason for switching HCM vendors, it was one of the top ones earlier in the poll today, but it's interesting that it was not one of the top ones in terms of what you're looking for next, right? So, and I always joke with customers because it almost never fails, right? So I'll have an initial conversation with a customer that makes their way to us, and I ask them, like, what's the problem today? Is it this? Is it this? Is it this? I try not to lead the witness too much. I just let them tell me what the problem is. And oftentimes customer service is way up there. And then a couple weeks later, we get into the process, and I develop their needs list with them, their must-haves, their nice-to-haves, like what are they looking for? And sometimes this group actually on the phone today gets a lot of credit that customer service is there at all, because what I'll often see is, although it's one of their top, maybe the top pain point that they're experiencing, sometimes it's not even on their list of what they're looking for. And I always joke with customers, I say, well, wait a minute, a couple weeks ago, you told me customer service was your biggest pain point, and it's not even on your list, right? And then I just kind of let the crickets go, and they're like, wow. And I let them off the hook pretty quickly. And it's it's a tough thing to quantify, right? So how do you evaluate customer service, right? Things like, which is, the reason I let them off the hook is because, a lot of things are relatively easy to quantify, like, budget, like, you have X to spend, does this provider, provide a full suite solution that you're looking for the X that you have to spend, right? And even to a certain extent, functionality is relatively easy to quantify. Do you need talent management functionality? Do you need onboarding? Do you need performance management, succession planning, compensation management, those things? Do you need time and attendance? Within time and attendance, do you need advanced scheduling? So it gets tougher once you get in the weeds of any of those functional areas. But generally speaking, it's quantifiable, right? It's a box to check. Customer service is a tough one, right? So how do you evaluate that? Because I can tell you that every single vendor that you talk to is going to tell you that customer service is their top priority, right? And so how do you differentiate? How do you quantify that, right? Because they'll all tell you that, and some will even put CSAT metrics in front of you, customer service metrics. And I always encourage customers to take those with a grain of salt. Don't disregard them, right? If somebody puts a customer satisfaction metric in front of you, CSAT, CRE, Net Promoter Score, whatever it is, I always encourage customers to look at that and consider it and compare it to other vendors. But I always encourage customers to understand that it doesn't reflect their entire customer base. And what I mean by that is, vendor XYZ, they'll put a 95% customer satisfaction number in front of you, and that looks great. That's great, But what does that 95% really mean? It means that 95% of the customers that bothered to fill out their customer satisfaction survey really like them. Well, okay. Well, how many people filled out the survey? Well, 40%. If they're lucky, right? 20, 40, maybe even 60%, right? But no one's getting 100%. On their surveys, they're just not, right? And so what that customer satisfaction number represents is a portion of their customer base. And I can tell you, because Newcastle Research does survey work, that the portion of the population, the customer base, that didn't fill out that survey is typically biased toward unhappy, because a lot of customers that are unhappy, they're not going to bother to stick around and fill out a survey. They're just going to leave, right? And so that doesn't really help you. That's just kind of pointing out the problem. So let me give you a solution. So the best way, in my experience, to measure customer service is to look at customer retention, right? So customers vote with their dollars. And a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about today, by the way, is intuitive. They're like, yeah, of course you did that. And so that's fine, But what I encourage everyone who sits in on webinars and customers that call me up for kind of a free, free follow-up, or customers that engage with Newcastle formally, don't lose sight of these things, because often you'll go in with a game plan and you'll understand, like, okay, this is how I want to evaluate it. These are the important things. And then you get in there in the demos and you see all these shiny bells and whistles, and you kind of lose sight of what the foundations of your search and what your decision should be based on. And so even if you're not looking for something today, tuck these notes away. If you're looking for something in 12 months, 18 months, pull them out. I promise you, if you adhere to these and make these considerations the foundation of your search and evaluation, you will significantly increase the chance that you're going to be happy. There's no guarantee, right? No one can guarantee that, but you're gonna set yourself up for success. So that was a little sidebar. But yeah, look at customer retention, right? Because customers vote with their dollars. To use another car analogy, if your neighbor across the street is on their 4th Ford F-150, you don't need to ask them if they like Ford F-150s, right? They bought 4 of them, right? And they keep buying them, right? So without even asking, that they love them, right? And that's what I mean by customer retention. Customers vote with their dollars. Retention is the #1 goal for SaaS HCM providers. And by the way, this is true of any company with a recurring revenue model, right? So a SaaS provider selling you software and the service that goes with that software, or Netflix or HBO selling you a streaming service, right? If you're paying them a subscription fee, their goal is to keep you. And that's fine, right? This is one of those scenarios where the entity, the organization selling you the product or service, their goal is in line with yours, right? They want you to be a customer forever, and you want to be happy. You want to be a customer forever. So it's not like, buying a refrigerator and, eventually the folks who made that refrigerator, they want it to break, right? They want you to buy a new one, right? In this case, the folks selling you the software as a service, they want you to be happy, and you want to be happy. So if retention is the #1 goal for SaaS HCM providers, judge them on that, right? So ask them what their retention rate is. So the logical follow-up question is, okay, so what's a good customer retention number? This stoplight imagery is something I put in front of customers a lot, and we have to kind of revisit the scholastic grade scale that we all grew up with, because people think like, oh, 92%, that's an A-, that's got to be leading. In reality, that's average, right? And there's nothing wrong with 92%, but just you always have to go in it with the correct frame of reference. If you look at all the vendors in the industry, you'll find, at least the ones that I've surveyed and take a close look at, which is a lot of them, most of them. And the reason I say most is because not all companies disclose their customer retention. I'll get to that in a second. But yeah, 90 to 94%, you're in that kind of average territory. Below 90% is quite rare. And then likewise, above, 94% above is also quite rare. So think of it like a bell curve, right? The majority are going to be in that 90 to 94% territory. Below 90%, as I said, that's uncommon. You really want to dig a little deeper to understand why and sometimes they have a good reason, by the way. There are some companies whose customer base, their average customer is less than 20 employees, right? And so there's nothing wrong with that, to focus on SMB customers, but statistically speaking, most companies that go out of business are SMB customers. Or SMB organizations, right? And so if your organization as an HCM provider, HRIS, HR technology solution provider, is squarely focused on really, really small companies, your customer retention rate is going to be biased toward that, because of that. And so sometimes there's a reason for that. Not always though, but once you get down below 90%, you really got to start asking some tough questions. And I would say even in that average territory, really kind of take a look at what's behind those numbers, because there's a big difference between, let's say, 96% and 92%. And some people look at that and they say, oh, well, one's an A and one's an A-. That's pretty close. I'm going to treat those the same. You shouldn't, right? Because if we flip those on if we invert those, right, the 92%, that means 8% attrition, right? And the 96% is 4% attrition. So that means mathematically, the organization with 92% customer retention versus the HCM provider with 96% customer retention, twice as many customers are heading for the exits every year. That's huge. That's 100% more, right? So there's an enormous difference between 92% and 96%. And the last thing I'll say on that is if you're in that 94, 95% and above, you're really doing something right? There's a big difference between, as I said, the 96 and 92. Mathematically, we talked about that, but also if you look under the covers a bit and really try to understand, a lot of customers are gonna leave in any given year, and it's not the fault of the HCM provider, right? So that customer, they might get acquired, they might merge, right? And that HCM provider might be doing nothing wrong, but that particular customer gets acquired, and the big fish says, we're using vendor XYZ, guess what? You're switching over to, so there's a certain amount of attrition that's out of the vendor's control. But once you get down below 94%, something else is going on. So that's a good, keep that stoplight. Other considerations, customer retention. Quick look on time, I think we're doing okay. Customer retention versus revenue retention. I'll use a quick math example. If an HCM provider has 10 customers at the beginning of the year, and at the end of the year, 9 of those customers are still there. They may have added a few more customers, but those are disregarded for the sake of the calculation. But of those 10 that were there, assuming their calendar year is their fiscal year, of those 10 that were there on January 1st, 9 of those are still there on December 31st. That's 90% customer retention. So that's simple math. If that one customer that left, however, represented 50% of their revenue, like that was by far and away their largest customer, then that only represents 50% revenue retention. The reason I point that out is because you may ask a potential customer, you may ask a provider what their customer retention is. They may give you a revenue retention number, and that's fine. And the reason that's fine, although they are different numbers, as you start to get, hundreds, thousands of customers, those two numbers start to look a lot alike. So don't be alarmed if you get a revenue retention number in response to your question about customer retention. Not all HCM providers disclose it. And I will tell you that's a red flag for me. If, as I said, that's their number one goal is to keep customers. And if they're not revealing what that retention number is, they're basically not willing to tell you how good they are at the one thing they're trying to do. That's a problem. And I've had conversations with presidents and CFOs at these vendors. One anecdote I shared, this was a conversation I had last year with a vendor, and I said, why don't you disclose it like your competitors? And his response was, well, we're a private company. We don't have to disclose it. And he didn't like my response. I said it in a joking way, but he didn't like it. I said, well, I'm not required to brush my teeth, but I still do it, right? Because it makes sense. And he didn't like that. But yeah, if they don't provide it, as I said, they're not telling you, they're choosing not to tell you how good they are at the one thing they're trying to do. And so that's a huge red flag. And the last thing I'll say on this is definitions vary. So as I mentioned, some customers are going to leave, and it's not the fault of the HCM provider, right? They get acquired, something happens, right? And sometimes it is their fault, but some vendors will put a number out there that is net of those things that they deem beyond their control. And so there's one provider out there that in their marketing material, they have 97% customer retention. And if you compare that to it's a publicly traded company, what's in their 10K, their annual report, it says 92%, right? And they don't always disclose the difference to customers. And so customers will often leave that demo, they'll leave that presentation thinking, wow, they're industry leading. They're 97%, when in reality, the actual number is 92%. And at the risk of sounding like a commercial, you're going to have a really hard time kind of sussing that kind of thing out with somebody like me in your corner. But to the extent you can, dive through their 10Ks, fact check everything that they tell you in the demo. Don't assume it. back it up and kind of cross-reference it wherever you can. It's a lot easier if they're publicly traded, but even if they're not, there's a lot of information out there that you can find. And then the last one, just to bring it full circle, what I did was I looked at all of the vendors out there that I had information on in terms of number of code bases and what their revenue retention is. As I said, not all vendors disclose the revenue retention, but to the extent I had visibility into the market, I just cross-referenced number of code bases versus revenue retention, and it's a super, super strong correlation. It's not an accident that the vendors out there, the providers out there that have a single code base tend to have really high revenue retention. And the vendors out there that have 2, 3, or more code bases tend to have a much lower revenue retention. So that mathematically, hits the nail on the head for what I talked about earlier in the presentation of how large that ripple effect is of that single database. But I think we're right up against it. Why don't we take the last couple minutes and let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you, Patrick. And as Patrick mentioned, now we would like to take your questions. So if you have a question, please type them into the chat box now. And also, as Patrick mentioned, we are almost at the top of the hour. So for the overflow, we will take them offline. So it looks like we have a few here. First question, what are the pros and cons of going with a smaller HCM vendor versus one of the larger market share leaders?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's one that comes up pretty often. It's a larger conversation. You really have to look at the specific large HCM vendor and at the specific small vendor to really draw a fair comparison. But generally speaking, with the larger vendors, they're going to have typically higher R&D, right? R&D spend, and so their technology might be keeping pace with the demands of the market at a quicker rate, if you will. But sometimes when you get thousands and thousands and thousands, sometimes tens and thousands of employees at these larger companies, sometimes things like customer service can suffer, right? So generally speaking, I would say large companies, high R&D, high technology spend. Smaller companies tend to have higher customer service, But as I said, you can sometimes get the best of both worlds, right? You can get a small company that maybe resells a larger company's technology, so you get that small company customer service coupled with the large R&D. But that's a great question.
Thanks, Patrick. And our next question is, what kind of customer support model should we look for?
Yeah, the short answer is one that works, right? So there are multiple models that work. It can be a designated rep, it can be a designated kind of pod of people that handle your questions. For me, the bigger metric is that customer retention. If you have, for example, if you have a 96% customer retention, 95, 96% customer retention, that to me speaks more to the quality of their customer service than any particular model. Because you can have a designated rep, designated customer service rep is what I mean, service model that might not be very good, right? You might have a really bad customer service rep. So just because you have a dedicated rep doesn't mean that rep is good. But you might have, another company might have a designated rep model and they have super, super high customer retention, right? And so for me, the retention is the better benchmark for customer service. But yeah, you tend to want to have some kind of designated model where you're calling the same people all the time, whether that's a group of people or a single person, because they get to know your business. But as I said, the better metric for that is customer retention. Good question,
Patrick. And there are a few more questions. Next question: how long should we expect the implementation to take?
Yeah, that's a good question. And again, it would be helpful to understand how big the company is that asked that question, because that varies considerably. So I'm not trying to dodge the question, but it really depends. If you're a small company, meaning like maybe let's say you have 50 employees, 100 employees, relatively small company, and you're all in one city, and it's a white collar insurance company, financial services company that doesn't have a lot of time and attendance needs. In other words, your needs are not complex. You're not a huge company, and you're in one geography. That's a pretty basic rollout, right? And then you're talking, weeks, months, a couple months, when you get through the process. But then you're on the other end of the spectrum, you're across, like that company I work with, across 30 countries, right? Thousands of employees. They have really complex time and attendance needs. That one's going to take 9 months, right? And so it really depends. It depends on what your needs are and how complex the solution is that you're trying to roll out. But again, I'll go back to one of the earlier slides. What's more important for me is that you have a really clear picture on the front end so you can make a decision. Like, how long should this take given our needs, given who we are, what we look like, where we are, what our geography is, what modules we're rolling out, how complex those modules are. For me, it's more important to have a clear plan, and then you can compare apples to apples, right, to all the vendors. I would say if there's a red flag to watch out for, if you're talking to 4 vendors and all of them are telling you, doing a really, really big deep dive into your needs, and they understand, how complex you are, and they're asking you a lot of questions, and they're laying out milestones and telling you what you're going to need to commit in terms of resources and so forth. And they're all telling you this is going to take 6-9 months or more. And you got one vendor over here who's kind of fudgy on the details and saying, oh yeah, we can have you up and running in a couple of weeks. That's a red flag. Right? So that's a good kind of rule of thumb is to look for the outliers in that regard. And then you have to dive a little deeper on those. But that's a great question.
Thank you, Patrick. And our final question: why should we consider company culture when considering an HCM vendor?
Yeah, it's a good question. Company culture is I think deservedly so getting a lot more attention, just in terms of, not just in terms of who you partner with, but people are using the technology to engage, to foster their own company culture. And so that's what I would say. 2 points. One, to the extent you company culture is a area of focus within your company, I think it makes sense that you would want to partner with a company who also focuses on culture, right? Because they're building the solution, they're building the technology, they're building the tool that you're going to use to help with employee engagement and to foster the culture that you want. And so I think intuitively it just makes sense to have the people building the software care about that type of thing and focus on that thing internally themselves. But then the other kind of more intangible aspect of it is, I think increasingly companies want to partner with people that share, or organizations that share their values, right? Newcastle Research, for example, we're a charitable organization. We donate a certain percent of our revenue to our environmental and social causes, and so I tend to look, for partners that share that philosophy. So I think that's another element, just to the extent you can partner with people in support organizations that kind of share your views on your cultural views, that's only going to help kind of spread that word, if you will. That's a really good question. Thanks.
Thank you, Patrick. And with that was our last question. So I'll turn it back to you for any closing remarks.
Yeah, no, thanks for everyone for spending time. As I said, I know by design we cover a lot of ground. And so if anyone has any additional questions, definitely feel free to reach out. Don't hesitate. I'm always happy to have those calls. I always learn something. The people always learn something. So yeah, I know I didn't leave a lot of time for Q&A, and I know Ty mentioned there was a few more there. But so if you have other questions, don't hesitate to reach out. And thanks for spending some time with us today.
Thank you, Patrick. A lot of great info and guidance there. And as Patrick mentioned, in order to remain on schedule, we will respond to the overflow of questions that came in by chat via email in a timely manner, but feel free to reach out to him directly if you'd like a quicker response. And with that, on behalf of HR Morning, I would also like to thank everyone for attending. This concludes our program.